Finally, ladies and gentlemen, for our final masterclass for today, just to let you know, we do have a concurrent session running next door on cyber vigilance. How much should we know by an ethical hacker? So for those of you who would like to find out more, you can head over to that breakout session. Otherwise, do remain here for the Masterclass 6 on succession planning. What works, what does not. So moving swiftly along, I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Shai Ganu, the Managing Director, Rewards Business Leader, Asia Pacific of Willis Towers Watson, Singapore, for his presentation. Please welcome Shai Ganu.
I think they might have misunderstood you thinking lunch is now instead of the... No, I'm kidding.
Just to double confirm, lunch is not now yet, yeah? Final masterclass. No. But I think we're just going to wait for a few more guests to make it into this hall.
Indeed.
We're going to do a little bit of exchange going on. Because next door we've got cyber vigilance by an actual hacker. And over here, we're going to talk about succession planning.
Perfect. So just to confirm, everybody in this room is here for the succession planning discussion. Yes? There's a concurrent masterclass next door on cyber security, cyber risk. All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again for being here. My name is Shai. I look after Willis Towers Watson's business in Asia Pacific. I'm based in Singapore. I'm a faculty member at ICDM, and we run a few courses on NRC director education, or particularly NRC member education. And this is a subject that's very close to my heart. Succession planning, what works, what doesn't work. We're going to talk about succession planning mainly from the context of succession planning at the board level, not succession planning in management, not succession planning in your senior executive team. And it's a subject that's close to my heart because as a consultant, as a practitioner, we advise clients on some of these issues, but I've also been on the receiving end of some of these interactions. I'm a board member of a few companies, some listed, some non. Across the region, I sit on some NRCs, some HR committees. And so I've been through this process both as a recipient and as the norm committee. So what we wanted to share with you today, very quickly, it's a fairly packed agenda. We have only an hour for this topic. So we'll try to keep this as quickly, or go through the material as quickly as possible. But please let this be an interactive discussion. So if any stage you have a question, please raise your hand. Let's have that conversation, that dialogue straight away. I'll try to cover the materials as quickly as I can so we can leave some time at the end for Q&A. As you know, I'm a consultant, so consultants don't leave the house without slides. And I have about 200 slides to get through today. No, I'm kidding, not that many. But we have a fairly packed agenda. So we'll start with talking about what are the key roles of the board and stewardship skills that directors need. Some of this will be an extension of the earlier discussions we talked about, but I wanted to just give you a frame to think about the roles of the board. Second, we'll talk about principles for board composition and refresh. What are the key determinants, key principles that every NRC member, every board member, every chair needs to think about when you're thinking about the composition of the board? Next, we'll talk about the business case for diversity of thought. And this is a subject that is very close to my heart. Diversity as a subject we've spoken about in the past. There was a great session this morning talking about diversity as well. But in particular, where Willis Towers Watson focuses a lot of our research effort is to try to prove the business case for diversity of thought. So not just doing it because it's a good moral issue, doing this because it's a good thing for business. And I'll share some of our findings, some of our research with you in a few minutes. Then we'll talk about succession planning for NEDs, non-executive directors, and the CEO. And particularly in this context, given we're talking about board succession, we're going to think about the CEO as an executive director, right? Because it's mainly succession for directors. I'll share some case studies, some public domain case studies, some based on a consulting experience, and then we'll try to summarize with some calls of action. All right? So without further ado, let's first start talking about what are the key roles of the board. Now, some of this was covered yesterday. We had a lovely panel discussion yesterday that talked about the roles of the board. But I wanted to give you a frame to think about what are the main responsibilities for any board. And all our research has actually suggested that the role of the board invariably comes down to one of these three things. Number one, ensuring regulatory conformance, right? Particularly relevant for listed company boards, particularly relevant for regulated companies or regulated industries, but ensuring regulatory conformance. Number two, driving or rather encouraging organization performance. Right? And I'm using my words carefully here. It's encouraging organization performance as opposed to driving or as opposed to actually doing the work. Because the old adage, managers manage and directors direct. Right? So the role of the directors is to coach, guide, be stewards of the business and guide management to achieve organization performance. Most academic research that you will see focuses on the first two aspects, the regulatory conformance and the organization performance. Even sort of our colleagues at Singapore Institute of Directors, in their board guides and some of their materials that they publish, they emphasize a lot on these two aspects, the regulatory conformance and driving performance. Willis Towers Watson research, and we've spoken to chairs, we've done a whole bunch of interviews, qualitative and quantitative research, to try to get to probably the third bucket, which doesn't get spoken enough because it's hard to quantify. And the third bucket, which is a fundamental role for any board, is to future-proof the organization. Right? It doesn't necessarily fall into a regulatory conformance bucket. It doesn't necessarily fall into your KPI monitoring, sort of giving management the tools bucket. It's about how do we ensure that this board will be relevant in 2030. Like the keynote session that we had yesterday, ecosystem partnerships, redefining the organization, looking at how can we still be relevant in the future. And it's easier said than done because often this requires a little bit crystal ball gazing, which is not easy, but we fundamentally think this is a key role for the board. So, okay, with this context, what we wanted to give you a sense or summarize some of our research was what would be the stewardship attributes that would be required under each of these buckets. And again, I'm using my words very carefully. These are not leadership attributes, these are stewardship attributes. And some of these are obvious, so I won't go through every one of them. Under regulatory conformance, of course, you have things such as risk management, integrity and ethics, compliance and audit. Under organizational performance, strategic visioning, I think that is a very important part. This becomes a heated debate, particularly with corporate governance enthusiasts, about who sets the strategy of a company. There is one camp that says the board sets the strategy and the CEO and the management team executes. There's another camp that says the CEO actually sets the strategy, defines the strategy, takes it to the board for recommendation and approval. My personal view is probably more the former, but whichever camp you're in, sort of that's not the purpose of this debate. The intent is, or the key message is, you still need strong strategic visioning skills and stewardship attributes on the board. Yeah? Developing people. If I ask all of you here, and we don't have a Slido poll right now, I'm actually going to do a poll this afternoon on something else. But if I ask all of you here, what is the number one challenge, or rather list your top 3 challenges that keep you awake at night? I'd venture a guess that 9 out of 10 of us would say one of our top 3 challenges is related to people. Either not enough people, or not the right people in the right jobs, or how do we extract the best value out of people? And again, this is a subject I'm very passionate about, so I particularly found Tanshri's, Arina's comments yesterday immensely helpful. She made a comment that one of the skills she feels that is missing on most boards today is human capital expertise. And I'm not just saying this because I'm an HR consultant, but we genuinely feel that true organization development capability, how do you extract best utility out of your people resources, that's a skill that not too many boards have. So developing people, we definitely feel is a strong stewardship skill or stewardship attribute. Change management, cross-cultural sensitivity, some of these I'll cover later on as well. But when we talk about the sustainability and future-proofing, of course, sustainability management. Datin Sudhita had a wonderful masterclass earlier about climate change and sustainability, a lot of learnings there. But some of these bullet points that you see later on, these are newer things that are starting to be spoken about at boards. Things such as gig economy governance, tech ethics, the old adage if you the old conundrum, self-driving car, How do you program a self-driving car to avoid crashing into one pedestrian, but then if it goes and hits a school bus full of children, then it could actually cause more mortality? How do you program that self-driving car? How do you build sort of your technology ethics at the board? And these are not easy answers, but these are certainly questions that more and more boards, or certainly skills that more and more boards will need. It doesn't mean that all of us need to have a PhD in tech ethics, but at least as board members, we need to ask the right questions for management to give you the right answers. Yeah? We'll talk more about this later on, but again, the last one, skills and organization development. And organization development, I think, is broader than HR. This is not about human resources. This is about true organizational transformation, organization development. And the word skills, again, one of the biggest risks that's facing organizations and society currently is, and I'm using my words carefully, is the perceived risk of obsolescence of jobs. It's a perceived risk because there's a lot of research that says for every job that will diminish in value, there'll be more jobs that will be created. So robots are not taking away our jobs, but it fundamentally means that organizations will need to upskill and reskill their employees. And we take a very strong view that that's the responsibility for the board. The board almost has a social imperative here to make sure that the organization is investing enough resources in developing and upskilling and reskilling its employees. A key aspect of future-proofing, right? So with that in context, we spoke about the roles of the board and some of the key skills. I wanted to lay this foundation because when we talk about succession planning, we need to link it back to what do you actually need on the board. But in the next section, let me quickly cover principles for board composition and refresh. Before we talk about the board refresh part, I did want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the different non-executive director roles that exist. Unlike executives, so in an executive team, you have a whole suite of roles, right? You have all your CXOs, and some of the titles are getting fancier by the day. Chief Storytelling Officer, like we saw Microsoft's example, Chief Dreamer, Chief Futurist. Actually, the Singapore government, Skills Future Singapore, and so this is a government entity, Skills Future Singapore has a role called Chief Futurist, trying to define future skills, future jobs, how work gets done, right? Now, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have the same sort of flexibility or same latitude when it comes to director roles, but there are enough models where you can see slightly different roles even within directors. I've listed some of these here. Clearly, board chair is the most common role. Lead independent director, quite a few organizations have lead independent directors, particularly in this part of the world, and I mean ASEAN. ASEAN has a disproportionately large number of listed companies that have a controlling shareholder. The controlling shareholder could either be the sovereign wealth fund, Temasek, Khazanah, whoever else, or it could be family founded. And in those cases where if your chairman is not independent, there is a very important role for a lead independent non-executive director. Sometimes you have a deputy chair. Most of us would be independent non-executive directors. Sometimes you have non-independent non-executive directors. You have nominee directors, you have shadow directors, etc., etc. Over break, I can share a strong, good anecdote about shadow directors. Shadow directors are essentially not official directors, but for all intensive purposes, they are influencing the decisions that the board makes. In a lot of these cases, this is usually the patriarch of the family-founded business. He or she does not sit on the board for good governance reasons, but any major decision, they need to approve, quote unquote. And they end up being shadow directors. And under some codes, so Singapore Companies Act, shadow directors are also liable. There's a very famous case of one shadow director being actually sued, even though he was not on the board. But I did want to call out this light purple box, which is external committee members. And I specifically am calling this out in the context of succession planning, because later on we'll talk more about this as one of the ideas for companies. External committees, so most of us, most companies in Singapore and Malaysia, both listed and non-listed, we will have a board of directors, and a subset of those board of directors will form different committees. You'll have an audit committee, most common, actually every company has an audit committee. You'll have a nominations and remuneration committee. Sometimes a nomination and remuneration is split, so you have a nomination and governance as one committee, and remuneration and talent management and succession planning as the other committee. Sometimes you have a risk committee, technology committee, etc., etc. Now, in most cases, these committee members are actually members of the board. Having said that, there are few companies, and I'll share some examples in a minute, there are few companies who appoint non-board members on these external committees. So these non-board members do not have the same fiduciary responsibilities as other directors, nor do they have the voting rights as other directors. But they are brought in specifically for the expertise that they have. They are brought in specifically for the skills that they have on a particular committee. Two notable examples. One is in the charitable sector. So particularly the volunteer welfare organizations, social service organizations, or institutes of public character, IPCs. Again, in Singapore, this is a very common role. In all these charitable organizations, you have special committee members who only serve on the committee. They don't serve on the full board. Second example, which is for listed companies, Indonesian state-owned enterprises. Quite a few Indonesian state-owned enterprises, again, by some of the regulatory requirements there, are required to have independent audit committee members who are not members of the board, and independent NRC members who are not members of the board, because they bring specific skill sets that the rest of the board may or may not have. So I think it's something worth considering further, but I wanted to share this in context of the different roles. So let's talk about then the process for a board refresh. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a consultant, and consultants, our lives are governed by frameworks. So this is a framework that we use. It has merit behind it. It's very intentionally also drawn as a circular framework, because board refresh is not a static exercise. Board refresh is a continuous exercise. A good nomination committee chair is always thinking about board refresh. I sit on a few nomination committee myself. I chair a nomination committee, and I tell you, it's not an easy job. It keeps us awake. The process, and our framework for this process, is you start by defining the needs. What are the needs of the board? What are the needs for the organization? It sounds simpler than it actually is, but it does require linking your board back to the strategic intent of the organization, back to where you see the organization not today, but 3, 5, 10 years down the line. And I'll share some examples with you in a case study later on. But you start by reviewing the board and committee's composition matrix. What skills do you need for the board? Second, sounds obvious, is you monitor the terms of your existing directors. If your existing directors all have served more than 10 years or more than 15 years, it's a sign that your nomination committee the process is not working too well. A good board should have an equal distribution of directors in the first term, second term, and third term. What do I mean by that? Most codes would say that a reasonable tenure for a director is 9 to 10 years. And most terms tend to be 3-year terms, after which you need to get re-elected at the AGM. So it's a good practice is to have almost an equal distribution of directors within each term. Directors who are still new within the first 3 years, so they bring a lot of fresh ideas, new perspectives. Director in the middle 3, and director in the last 3, so sort of 7 years to 10 years, because those directors are also equally important. They're equally important because they have the institutional knowledge, they have the context, they have the history. Again, I'm speaking to my Singapore colleagues here, and I see quite a few familiar faces who've worked in Singapore. As you know, Singapore Code of Corporate Governance was changed last year in 2018, and one of the pieces of the code that was received most attention was this 9-year rule. The rule was that after 9 years, if a director has served for more than 9 years, he or she will be deemed as non-independent. And it was most discussed and most hotly debated topic in all the changes in the code or all the revisions in the code. Initial drafting of the code or some initial ideas, it was recommended that after 9 years, the director should be forced to step down. And few of us, myself included, we actually counseled against that because there is a lot of research that suggests that institutional investors in particular place a premium for at least one director having more than 9 or 10 years tenure. Because he or she will have the historic context, they will know all the decisions that were made in the past, and you need that combination of history and sort of the new blood, new perspectives, new ideas. I'll share some research with you in a few slides, but particularly on this monitoring the terms, it's important to have this good mix. Third, obvious sourcing. Sourcing, how do you source? You build your talent pool, build your talent pipeline. And sourcing in particular has to be a continuous exercise. It's not a one-off exercise. It's not something you do just in the Q1 and forget about it. It's actually a responsibility for every director. And so sourcing, of course, every director should recommend people that he or she knows. But one of the criticisms behind groupthink has been that directors only bring in their friends. So good sourcing, actually, we would recommend that there is an independent sourcing that's done. You can either use headhunters or executive search firms, or if you're lucky enough to be in Malaysia, you can use the services of ICDM. That was my plug for ICDM. Who does board appointments, board refresh, gives you a good source of candidates, right, for director roles. And again, these sorts of candidates are professional directors. So it's about looking at what skills that you need at the board. Point 4, maintain that pipeline. As I mentioned, it's not a static exercise. It has to be a continuous exercise. Training. So once a director is actually appointed, he or she needs training. We all underestimate, most of us who are not seasoned directors, most of us who are new or aspiring directors, we often underestimate how complex a switch it is to make from being an executive role to a non-executive director. Especially if you want to do the NED role well. And what I mean by that, it's easy to hide in an NED role because no decision is made by an individual. Most decisions are made collectively by the board. So it's easy for an ineffective NED to be hidden, sort of be quiet, not challenge convention, just don't rock the boat too much. But that's not what you want from your directors. You want your directors to actually challenge management, to challenge chair, to challenge each other so that you come up with a collective, better outcome for the company. And last but not least, fundamentally important, board evaluation. There needs to be a regular performance evaluation of the board, its committee, its chair. These evaluations are not about singling out individual directors, but these evaluations are more about, as a board, are we collectively exercising the responsibilities that are expected from us? And then it becomes circular because outcomes of the board evaluation should define your needs for next cycle. You may discover at the end of your board evaluation that you don't have enough cybersecurity related skills because your industry is being disintermediated, is being digitalized at a pace faster than others. So you need cybersecurity or you need somebody who has experience with ecosystem partnerships. So it needs to be a continuous loop. Now, I know I spent a little bit time on this frame because even in our case studies, we'll refer back to this frame. This should apply for the board refresh. This should also apply to individual directors. So when you're looking at individual director assessment, again, you start with the skills, you start with what you need, go through the sourcing process, maintain pipeline, training, evaluation, and refresh. Okay? Next, let's look at a little bit at the business case for diversity of thought. And again, all of this is related at the board level, not necessarily management level. I know there was some example shared yesterday. Alan, you had a great example with a client or a company of yours that you worked with where the board could not have its desired diversity, but you tried to get that at the management level, and that's a really good example because in the end, what fundamentally matters is you have diversity of thought, you have diversity of experience. Whether that's at the board level or the management level, I think we can live with either, as long as collectively the managers and the stewards are bringing different and varied enough perspectives That's important for shareholders, that's important for the organization. Now, there has been a lot of talk about diversity, rightfully so. As I said earlier, it is a societal issue. It is a societal issue to make sure that there is equal and appropriate representation, not just of gender, but also of minorities, also of people who may not fit the mold of the collective, right? But broader than a social issue, it's a business issue. And there is a lot of research done around this, and I'll share some of Willis Watson research with you in a minute, about how diverse boards actually lead to better company performance. But before we talk about diversity, or share some of that research, allow me to share why board diversity is important. Number one, avoidance of groupthink. So particularly important in a board context. It's in a board context because no individual is making a decision, unlike the CEO or unlike the CFO. No one individual is fully accountable for any decision. It's the board collectively that makes decisions. So it's actually a very natural tendency to agree with either the most dominant voice or to agree with the majority view. There were some great examples mentioned in the panel yesterday, and some really good counsel to directors as well, that don't be afraid to ask a question. Don't be afraid to say, I don't understand. Don't be afraid to say, I disagree. But most boards, particularly the small to mid-cap companies, there tends to be a strong semblance of groupthink. And a good test of that is to check in any meeting, in any resolution, at what point in that conversation does your chair speak? If your chair speaks first, usually that's a sign of a board that has groupthink. Because if your chair speaks first, again, we're all Asians in an Asian context, most people will agree with the chair, particularly if he or she is a very strong personality. Good chairs, and when we teach the NRC course with ICDM, we actually counsel that good chairs should should share their views last. A good chair actually elicits views from all other directors first, then he or she shares his or her view at the end. That is a good way of avoiding groupthink. But of course, broader than groupthink, diversity gives better input to management. If you have diverse board members with different experiences, different skill sets, they're likely to give better inputs. And I'm being very careful here to say better inputs, because one risk of diverse boards is you end up creating too much work for management, right? Not every idea a director has is a good idea. Increasing understanding of the business, increased social acceptability. One of the case studies that I have to share with you later on, this was a retailer in Singapore, very well-known brand, but I've kept them anonymous. Retailer in Singapore, and their board, before we started working with them, their board out of 10 directors, 9 were above the age of 65. Think about most retail buyers, right? The consumer. Most of the consumers are between, say, or rather, the biggest portion of the consumers are between the age of 30 to 45, middle income, middle class sort of families, women and men, who buy groceries, who buy food, who buy retail. The Air Asia example was a great example yesterday as well, where you appointed somebody on the board because she could represent the needs of the consumer better. Right? So having increased social acceptability, not just from a gender perspective, but from an age, ethnicity, cultural perspective is also important. And so when we think about different attributes of board diversity, this is our frame, the Willis Watson frame that we think about diversity of thought. Number one, and very rightfully so, we start with gender. Fundamentally important. Again, not because it's just a social cause, also because there's a lot of research that men and women have very different ways of approaching problems and very different ways of coming up with solutions. I'm not going to share any stereotypical notions about men being more bravado and women being more prudent. There's a lot of research around behavioral styles around this. It does end up happening. One big advantage of having women on boards, and if you speak to any of the progressive chairs, they would share with you that a big advantage of having women on boards is women tend to be more measured or tend to consider more perspectives before making a decision. What would be the employee perspective? What would be the environmental perspective? What would be the social perspective? As opposed to sort of the, the risk of sounding stereotypical, if it's a group of all men, they are less likely to consider all other factors before making a decision. Right? So gender, number one. Number two, age. So the 2018 revision of Corporate Governance Code in Singapore, for the first time, specifically spells out age diversity. It's a move that in Singapore we heralded well, because again, and by the way, when I mean age diversity, I don't just mean younger directors. Age diversity can go both ways. And if ever there is an example of importance of more mature age leaders, your last election has shown us very clearly that this is a good example. Right? So age needs to be both ways. I guess one of the reasons for calling out age diversity is having multi-generational, multi-age profile directors gives you multiple perspectives. Number three, board tenure. I spoke briefly about this, but you want directors who are sort of across, who have very tenures. Some very new tenures, some very old tenures. And I'll share some results with you in a minute. Number four, culture or ethnicity. Again, it talks about different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. If any of you are in charitable or social cause boards, having different cultures helps with fundraising. Any charitable organization, one of the biggest responsibilities for the board is to help with the fundraising. It's not a job that we enjoy. It's actually a very specialized skill set, but it's a big responsibility. And again, having multiple cultural perspectives gives you access to multiple social cliques and social groups that can help with fundraising or that can help with furthering the cause of your society or cause. Number five, international experience. 6, industry, and 5 and 6 are important because, again, having international experience or working across multiple industries, we've seen yesterday so many examples of organizations needing to operate in an ecosystem. And so if you have geographical expertise or if you have industry expertise, it helps improve the quality of decision-making within your organization. And number 7 and 8, these are, again, subjects that we feel very passionate about. It's about having functional domain expertise and different skills expertise. So I won't put you in a spot, but when we do this session during the NRC training, we actually do a poll. If you think about most directors in Malaysia, particularly your small to mid-cap, most directors will have backgrounds either in law, they're either lawyers or ex-law firm partners or legal practitioners. They would be accountants or ex-accountants or auditors because the audit committee responsibility, or they would be businessmen, and generally businessmen, or somebody with commercial backgrounds, right? So either they know the family or they've been in business with the family. Majority of the directors currently have these 3 skills. Tanshi Zarina mentioned yesterday that some of the missing skills, cybersecurity, human capital, public relations. Public relations is often an understated skill. A lot of corporate scandals could have been avoided if the board had better public relations skills among the directors. What to say, or rather what not to say, sometimes is equally important as what to say. So looking at skills and domain expertise more holistically, we have seen actually has stronger correlation with business performance. So let me share this with you. And again, this is a little bit of an eyesight test, but this is research that we did in Singapore, looking at correlations between company performance and different attributes of diversity. I know I'm sharing Singapore research with you because unfortunately, we are not having this conversation 12 months in the future. 12 months in the future, so ICDM and Willis Watson is actually going to partner on a similar study for Malaysia, where we'll repeat the study for Malaysia to look at importance of, or rather correlations of company performance and different attributes of diversity. Our hypothesis, though, would be that the findings would be similar. So let me share some of the key ones with you. So independence. Independence was one of the traits that we try to look at. Now, most corporate governance experts would tell you that having a 100% independent board is a good thing? Not necessarily. Our research actually suggests that there is a sweet spot. When you have 75 to 80% independent directors, those companies tend to outperform when you either have 100% independent directors or where you have less than 70% independent directors. Why? Because you at least need one director who's representing the interests of the majority shareholder or the controlling shareholder. Right? That tends to be more sustainable long-term performance. By the way, our definition of performance here was 3 to 5 years, depending upon the metric. Some of the more financial measures, we looked at 3 years, but things such as share price, dividends, earnings per share, we looked at 5 years. Economic value add, EVA is another measure. We looked at 5 years for that. So having directors between 75 to 80% of your board being independent tended to be the sweet spot. Number 2, age. So we try to look at correlations between age and company performance. Our hypothesis was having younger directors would mean better performance. Unfortunately not. And at the risk of revealing my age, unfortunately not. However, what we did find was when companies who had at least one generational difference between the oldest and the youngest director, those tended to outperform. So it wasn't that below 40 is their magic number. It wasn't that above 80 is the magic number. The magic number was there needs to be at least one generational difference between the oldest and the youngest. And those companies tended to have better performance. Now, look, I fully appreciate that everything I'm talking about is correlations, not causality. Right? But the correlations are, you can't deny them, right? They're actually pretty strong. Gender, again, I'm sharing data here, so some of these statements will be controversial. We did find that having at least one woman on board was better, resulted in better performance. 2 was the sweet spot, but having more than 2 female directors on the board did not see incremental improvement. I'm not making any judgment based on that statement. I'm just sharing the data. Yes, sir. In Singapore, there are. So out of the top 200, about 30 or 40 have 3 or 4 female directors. One of the boards that, I can share some of this data with you later on. But it's a very fair question. I think there are some, sorry, Michelle. Yeah. I mean, the 30% club itself would mean that out of 10, 3 are female, right? But I can share some of the data with you later on. It's a good point, but the point I wanted to make is let's not just go diversity for the sake of diversity. The answer is not we need half-half, just for the sake of it. The answer is we need the right skills on the board. Right? And if some of those skills are better represented by women, as an NRC chair, you'd be, it's in your best interest to look for women directors to represent those skills. And then maybe talking about very quickly domain expertise, boards that had more than 4 different domain expertise tended to outperform. So having one more rather than your commercial, legal, accounting, etc. Okay, conscious of time, let's talk about the succession planning for NEDs and directors. I covered the succession planning framework earlier for NEDs, so I won't go through this again. It's essentially the same framework. I did want to call out a specific nuance for the CEO. And for the CEO, again, the process is similar. You define the needs, you develop the criteria. The difference is how you source candidates. Right? So again, I'm sharing the CEO because as we're talking about succession planning for boards, most CEOs in listed companies tend to have executive directors, the CEO as a managing director or as an executive director as well. So the governance process still goes through the nominations committee. If your CEO is not an executive director, good practice would suggest that some board committee should have oversight. If not the nominations committee, then at least the HR or the remuneration committee. But if your CEO is also an executive director, the nomination committee needs to take ownership of the process. The difference here is in the sourcing of candidates. Now, unlike directors, where most of the candidates will be sourced externally, for CEO role or for executive directors, I think it behooves us to also look at internal candidates as a starting point. Particularly in this part of the world, a big criticism of the last decade or so has been that we've been too reliant on external talent. Organizations need to spend, and are spending more time building their own timber. But it's not, again, just a social, let's do this because it's the right thing to do. There is also data to support this. So again, once we do this exercise in Malaysia next year, I'll be able to give you Malaysia stats, but I'll share with you Singapore stats. Top 200 listed companies, Singapore, 1/3 of the directors, everybody's okay, it was just a chair, nobody fell. 1/3 of the CEOs were newly appointed in the last 3 years. Internal appointees, this is interesting. Internal appointments, day one TSR, share price actually drops because the market doesn't perceive internal appointments as favorably. Share price at the end of the first year, so end of 12 months, share price goes up, or TSR goes up by around 12%. External hires, day one share price actually spikes. End of year one, it actually drops. Now again, I'm only sharing data. We haven't, if you look at the reasons behind it, it is very likely that you only hire an external CEO in times of crisis. Things are not performing well, so I need to bring in a new CEO externally to help save us. So maybe 1 year is not a good enough time frame to sort of get the hockey stick effect. But that is one data point. Second data point about internal CEO versus external CEO. Internally promoted CEOs cost the company on average 15% less. Total comp for an internally appointed CEO, either as a CFO or a business unit head, again, this is Singapore data, we'll repeat this for Malaysia next year, costed the company 15% less. Lower on base pay, higher on variable. Because externally hired CEOs tend to ask for higher base pay and proportionally lower variable. Again, as an NRC member, as a REMCO member, you want the former. You want lower base pay, so your fixed costs are lower, and then you want more pay at risk linked to performance. That's a separate whole masterclass on compensation, which I won't go through right now. But then we'll talk about assessment, assessing the candidate, assessing using objective tools, and there are a lot of psychometric tools, there are a lot of behavioral tools, leadership assessment tools. And 6, which is very important, is the transition. Transitioning from your current CEO to the new CEO. One of the boards that I sit on, we had to transition our CEO. Our CEO had to step down for health reasons. And it was a 6-month process for the transition. And even after the CEO stepped down, she continued as an advisor role for 6 months after that, almost as a consultant to the new CEO. To give advice on context, to give advice on what's happened in the past. That transition process from a shareholder perspective is very important. Okay, so when you're thinking about assessment of stewardship styles for individual directors, our research also suggests that these are some of the softer attributes, right? Not things that you can look into an annual report and see MBA, PhD, not those kind of things, but some of the softer skills. So attitudes and values, they need to align with the organization's mission and vision. Needs to be a team player, needs to work well with the rest of the organization, work well with the board. Skills aligned with the identified gaps on the board and complementary to the board's strategic priorities. Ability to interact positively and productively with others, and may have actually served as a volunteer or is not unfamiliar to the board on some cause. Either has been an advisor or has been part of some of the committees, but has spent enough time with the organization, with the board. Right? Again, as directors, probably one of the most important skills for a good director is the skill of influencing. And I say good directors because the most directors, it often bothers me when I hear CEOs refer to directors as bosses. Theoretically, they're not. The bosses are shareholders. Right? Directors are elected by shareholders as stewards of the company, but the directors are not the bosses. And if directors go into their job thinking that they are bosses, the relationship with management will always be authoritative. It will not be consultative, it will not be influencing, it will not be advisory. Our research of the better performing boards actually suggests that good directors are influencers, are coaches, are mentors, they're not bosses. Yeah? So I think that's an important part when you think about skills. Conscious of time, so we'll just very quickly talk about the role of the nominations committee. And this is a quote that is very close to my heart. So the CEO of one of Singapore's largest banks said this. He said this in a forum with Chatham House rules, so I won't attribute the quote to him. But he said, the board, and in turn the nominations committee and the remuneration committee must set the tone for the culture in the organization by placing the right people in the right jobs, determining what performance is valued and which behavior gets rewarded. That last part of that sentence is immensely powerful, about which behaviors get rewarded. Before moving to Singapore, I used to work in Australia in one of the banks there, and my old boss, the CEO of this bank, she always used to say, the good thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. The bad thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. Right? So you've got to make sure that you're encouraging the right behaviors and thwarting the wrong ones. Okay. So then, what is the role of the NC in the director nomination process? We spoke about that circular process, but specifically, I think the NC needs to spend time about developing profiles for your new directors, understanding what the role of the director is, actually defining the role of the director. And for those of us who think that the role of the director is only confined to reading the papers and attending the board meetings, that model is going to change very quickly. Already you have several jurisdictions, several countries which have started thinking about the role of the board as more of an advisory board. Again, I'm getting a little crystal ball gazing here, but advances in technology, particularly blockchain technology, smart contracts, most of the compliance side of the role of the board is likely to be automated. Right? I mean, if you think about it, and not everybody will agree with this view, but if you think about it, if your company accounts are on the blockchain, smart contracts, immutable, irrefutable data, verifying accounts, and the audit and compliance function of the role starts diminishing, then the role of the director increases more and more about advisory to help drive company performance. Searching candidates, shortlisting candidates, evaluating candidates, and then recommending to the board for approval. This search, shortlist, and evaluate, again, I went through this process myself when I was getting appointed on the board. It was very interesting being on the other end of this, on the receiving end. This board first identified what are the gaps, what are the skills that it lacks. Sorry, it first identified that 5-year business plan, what are the growth priority that it needs. Linked to these growth priorities, it then defined what are the skills that the board needs. Then it said, okay, let's look at our current cohort of directors, people who are stepping down, what skills did they have, what skills do we lack. Then they specifically looked for directors or aspiring directors who had those skills. And the process was interesting. Every one of the nomination committee members had to nominate 3 directors to go into the pool. We also commissioned an external search. So there was a short list of 10 candidates that the nomination committee chair interviewed. 3 shortlisted candidates actually met with the full board, and then 1 was appointed. Right? So it was a fairly rigorous process, but the reason for doing this is also to ensure comfort level and to ensure collegiality with the board when the director is appointed, so that there are no surprises later on. And again, linked to this, part of the role of the NC is a very thorough onboarding policy. Now, most onboarding right now talks about, I guess, company-specific aspects, sharing the history, sharing the directors, where we came from, what's our legacy, what's our plan. Some of these onboarding programs, for those of you been through this, talks about your fiduciary responsibilities. So the last bucket here, formal training on governance, enterprise risk, regulatory risk. Very few companies actually take the time to induct directors about industry-specific challenges and industry-specific nuances. And I know that's easier said than done, but your management team has spent so much time building those capabilities about a particular industry. It's important to induct your board into that. And some good ideas we see, your seasoned director as a mentor. Right? We often tend to have a mentor, one of the board members acting as a mentor for the CEO of a management team. That's equally important for your new directors. Having either an ex-director who stepped down, a former chair, one of the seasoned directors to almost act as a mentor for new directors. Again, I'm sharing all of these as examples of how do we make the director's role more effective. Because the easiest thing to do is do nothing. Let the director learn on the job. But then you've spent years for this director to come up to speed before he or she could feel comfortable enough to challenge and to start adding value. Good companies would make sure the directors start adding value from day one. And this last part about directorship, and I've had this conversation with Michelle, personal view, I think organizations like ICDM have a very important role in ensuring professional development of directors. The training courses that you provide, not just related to the fiduciary aspects, but to all aspects of a director. Blockchain for directors, cybersecurity for directors, remuneration and nomination committee matters for directors. I think these are very important for any new director to build up these skills. You may not sit on that committee, but as a board member, you still have to approve everything that comes from the committee. So you better know what you're approving, right? Okay. I won't go through some of this in interest of time. Let's talk quickly about the case studies. So this was a case study where we were engaged to define the skills required for the board of the future. As I mentioned earlier, this was a retail sort of FMCG type company, going through a lot of disruption. As you know, any FMCG, any retail organization, biggest threat right now, people like online, right? So your Lazadas, your Redmarts, your Zaloras, that's your biggest threat. Even luxury retailers, people like your Louis Vuitton or whatever, even today would tell you that shop fronts are only for the experience. Very rarely do people actually buy in the stores. People will go and look at the goods in the stores, but they'll buy online. So this is an organization in an industry that's going through significant transformation, significant disintermediation. Unprecedented disruption and blurring the boundaries between industry. So again, if you think about food, you have staples and you have processed food and you have hot food, right? Cooked food. Boundaries are blurring. Grab, nowadays Grab will do delivery, right? Grab food. Business model diversification. So it used to have a chain of retail outlets, but that is not enough. And neither is just purely setting up an online sales channel enough. It needed a board of directors with the right skills and experience. So the work that we did with them was actually taking a step back, linking the 10-year vision or the 5-year plan that the company had, and try to identify what are similar companies globally who've been through a similar business model change. And I specifically mean business model change because the peer group that we came up with actually did not have, only a third were in the same industry. We look like people like Walmart, but also people like Netflix. What skills did their boards have? Because the key purpose behind this exercise was we wanted to look at any large organization or any organization in industry that has gone significant change in the business model, what skills do those directors have? And based on that, we did an inventory of all the directors, what were the key skills, sort of did a ranking order, and came up with a view of what would be the recommended skills for this board in the future. We put these in 4 buckets: domain expertise, industry knowledge, diversity of thought, and functional expertise. So the domain expertise, as you can imagine, a lot of these are what we see in most traditional boards: finance, audit, or risk management, marketing, PR, supply chain and distribution. As I mentioned, this is a retail organization, so supply chain was critically important for them. Organization development or transformation, people business, consulting. They specifically called out consulting because consulting or professional services broadly tends to have exposure to multiple industries and multiple geographies. So they wanted a director who's got that experience working in multiple industries. Industry knowledge, retail FMCG, food, beverage. Interestingly, even though this was a retail organization, it was important to have somebody with investment banking and M&A experience. Why? Because part of this company's growth priorities were also inorganic growth. M&A, expansions, capital raising, moving outside Singapore. So a big part of that would require, both at management and director level, skill sets of somebody who's done large M&A deals, large investment management. Diversity of thought, some of this we've spoken about, I won't go through that later on. And functional experience. So functional experience, digital transformation, a director who in his or her executive role has gone through a large-scale change, a customer centricity transformation, somebody who's had experience implementing a new business model. Now, when we shared some of this with the chair, his first reaction was, so are you saying, Shai, that I need 20 directors? Because we have 5 in each category. The answer was no. What we then did was we mapped the current directors against these skills to almost give you a gap, high, medium, low. And based on this, there was a recommendation of which area should they focus on. So they didn't try to get all. You try to look at which are the key skills that you need for the short term. I won't go through this again in detail because I'm getting the time's up sign. But this is Singtel's example of setting up the board and the board composition. All of this is from public domain information with Singtel. Singtel is actually a great example of a company who's played the long game when it comes to selecting the right directors. As you know, every telco, and Axiata is a great example here as well, but every telco is going through a significant business model change. One of the skills that every telco is trying to develop is more of a digital ecosystem, non-traditional telco operations. So Singtel actually identified certain skills that they want. One of the skills that they wanted was a venture capitalist / tech incubator director. And they identified this gentleman, Mr. Venki Ganesan, and this is again all in the annual report, who's a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. Rumor has it that they actually waited for 3 years for him to join the board because they identified him so early in the process that we want somebody. He was not ready because he had other commitments in the time, at that time. So again, this building your talent pipeline needs to be a long game. If these are the right skills for the board, it's worth waiting for those. Okay. I will end here. In a nutshell, these are some key questions that the board should be asking. Is there a structured, rigorous, and objective process in place to ensure business continuity for critical roles? Am I confident in the tools that are available to assess potential successes? Do we have contingencies for both planned and emergency succession? So I loved Alan's example earlier on where the deputy chair could immediately step into that case study. Are we clear on the different risks associated with succession planning and emergency replacements? And do we have a clear line of sight into executive ranks below the C-suite? Most boards spend time only on the C-suite, not levels below. But true and good succession planning, even if it's for future successors to the CEO, actually you need to look at top talent and high potentials even below your CXOs. And I'll end with this quote. This quote is again by a very seasoned chair of a listed company in Australia. How a board handles succession management is viewed as a proxy for the competence and care it brings to its governance responsibilities. I thought that was a really powerful quote. How the board looks at succession planning, both internally for itself as well as for the management team, is a really good proxy on how seriously it takes its job and its responsibility to its shareholders. All right, I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so if there are any burning questions, happy to take them now, otherwise happy to talk over lunch. But if not, we may end the session. Thank you.